Hello, everyone. Welcome to another author's interview here on the YouTube channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. I have with me guests whose story they've written is very, very interesting. My guest today is a seasoned IT professional who in his spare time has written a few novels, the first of which was published in the spring of 22. One of the books we will be discussing is entitled Ginger's Pope. The story follows Lewis Ginter, a man who lost fortunes and rebuilt his life many times over the years. After the Civil War, he invested in tobacco and became a Gilded Age magnate. His life was drastically different from so many of his peers because he fell in love with a younger man. They lived as a couple in a time when connections and marriages created wealthy federations. He and John Pope built their cigarette empire in Richmond, Virginia, and were known throughout the region for their philanthropy. Now, this is a part of history I know nothing about, and joining us to give more in-depth detail about this story is the author himself, John Musgrove. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. So before we dive into the book, John, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your background and how you came about writing your novels?
Sure. I have 5 university degrees and none of them are in history. I don't know what I was thinking, but I've always been a history nerd. I love the stories, the tales behind the dates and the big events. So I probably should have been a historian, but I'm not. I do find when I'm picking up books that I'm more likely to pick up historical fiction or something that's going to give me a biographical feel for an age. I started writing more nonfiction than anything else 25 years ago for a friend who is blind. I started doing a travel log, and she wanted to know what we were doing on our travels. So I would send her this travel log of everything we did, saw, ate, laughed at, any obstacles. And I've grown my following from there. So I've probably written my million words. But then, of course, I got into this idea of Ginnter, and it's Ginnter, not Ginger.
Okay. Thank you.
And all of the stuff he did for Richmond, and all of it was done pretty much without the notoriety that would, go with somebody like that, and to find out that he had a younger man, that filled in his time as he, edged toward the end of his life. It was just absolutely amazing. I looked everywhere and couldn't find a book that covered those.
Really?
And I thought, well, I'm going to have to write it because, it's got a little bit of so much of my life in the book, that I had to share that with others.
Fascinating, fascinating. So now that you talk about the book itself, so how did the whole process come about with research, planning the outline, and getting everything from the idea to seeing it in a physical copy?
I practice what they call head writing. So I will come up with a story idea and I will turn that over in my brain for weeks, months, years. I'm constantly researching. And every time I get a squirrel moment, then I run over to the internet or I run to the library and I say, what does this mean? And why does this, fit into here? And I just started building this enormous spreadsheet of everything that I could find about this time period, these people, how they lived, everything, daily life. What would you have to go through in 19th century Virginia, to accomplish just, working in a normal job. And
right.
I built the story in my head, but I really, really didn't know where to start the book. And that is always the hardest part for me is where do I start? I want to drop the reader right in the middle of things. So we have this cemetery in Richmond called Hollywood Cemetery, and Lewis Ginter has this monumental mausoleum. It is unbelievable. It's so beautiful. It is so to the time period he died in 1897. It's this, iconic building made out of marble. 3 stained glass windows are in it that are all made of comfort Tiffany. So when the sun's shining through, it's just this ethereal feel. And John Pope is nowhere near him. And I kept looking and looking.
Really?
And I finally had to go back to the office and said, I'm looking for one particular person, John Pope. And they gave me this huge map because Hollywood's been there 100+ years, and said, this is where he is. So I went, and John Pope is buried in a double plot by himself. And I
Really?
get there and I choke up, and I realize that they were probably meant to be buried together. And John Pope died first. So there was no one to argue for Lewis being buried next to him. And he is there alone since 1896.
Wow.
I was overcome with emotion. It's like a November crisp day. And I just sank down and sat on this stone wall and, started thinking through what would Lewis have done when he saw this the first time. And then it struck me, like stepping on a rake. John Pope has a sarcophagus that is raised above ground, and his actual name inscribed into it is facing the back wall. There's nowhere to tell unless you actually, desecrate the grave, walk around inside to see his name. And I just imagine Lewis Ginter seeing that for the first time and going into a rage that they would put his name to the back wall instead of the front where people could see it. And by the time I got home, I'm maybe 15 minutes from there, I was already typing in my head.
Wow.
I sat down for real to write the book, first manuscript with a good outline and a good idea. New Year's Eve 2017, and I finished the 400-page draft in 50 days. 50.
Wow.
And I'm working a full-time job. I'm doing normal life stuff. It was such a driving force within me. I would race home and I would start typing, and I would just, okay, skip dinner. I'm going to keep going. And it was the best experience ever.
Wow. So what was the feedback like when you finally got the draft? Did you tell family and friends, and what was their reaction?
Everybody really loved it. I sent it out to a couple of beta readers, and most of them were asking for really odd stuff. And I realized I probably need a writer's group. And I found some people who were historians and experts in Richmond that could actually give me that pointed feedback. You did this wrong, or this event's rather out of place, or that's the stuff I was concerned with. I knew I had the emotion right. I knew I had the story down pat. It was the mechanics. And then I know absolutely as a writer, I need somebody else to read this. So I hired an editor. I found her through James Brewer Writers. It's a local writing group. She did an amazing job. She did it all, it was all online because we live so far apart. And all of her feedback was so pertinent. I was calling the people men, and she kept saying John Pope's still not a man, and it just pointing out those inconsistencies where I'd said, this is the oldest sister, and then I'd refer to her later as the youngest sister. Those consistency things that an editor can find. By the time I was ready to go to a publisher, they really looked at me like, are you kidding? We don't even need to edit this. And, they read through it, and they did do a proofread just to make sure, spelling mistakes and things.
Right.
And then we were ready to go within, weeks instead of months.
Really? That quickly?
Yeah, well, my first editor had been that brutal with me, and I'm so grateful she was. Yeah.
Well, that's actually really good. When I actually got, for myself, getting an editor, I didn't know what to expect, but yeah, the editors, one of my friends who was actually, she herself is an author, and she's completely honest and brutal, and she holds nothing back. But that's also really important when you're writing a book, any kind of book. You want someone that's going to be honest and be critical. And then kind of into the next question, when you began writing this book, did you initially have a promise you were making up to the readers? Because I would imagine for a book like this, there has to be history back to it because it is historical, but you don't want to make it academic if it's not trying to be academic. So you kind of find that middle ground when you were writing it.
The thing for me is that I really clung to as a writer was that I wanted it to be unflinching as a portrayal of a three-dimensional character. You know, both of the men, they have flaws. They are, you know, generous, but they can also be mean. You know, they might have a sarcastic streak. And I think, you know, to get that three-dimensional view of someone gives a better taste of what reality is like. You know, like much like we see an actor on the stage or something, we want to
Right.
see that full-bodied person. But there's also that old adage that no one is a villain in their own story. So even the people that were against them or fought against them, I wanted to show them as human. They're not monsters. It's not orcs or, you know, something out of the world. They're
Right,
real
right.
life human beings that opposed what they were doing at times, sometimes for no reason at all. But I wanted to paint them as another part of humanity. They had different things that was pushing them forward. The one that stands out, of course, is the minister's wife. Everyone expects the minister to say, I object to this relationship. And it was the minister's wife who was saying, wait a minute, we can't associate with this couple. They're not following the Lord's, you know, commandment. And, you know, it's just that kind of conflict where everybody can't be happy in Disney about it. There's going to be some opposition.
Right. Absolutely. So when you got your draft and you got it published, and I imagine getting those first reviews was probably an amazing feeling. Getting the reviews from people who bought your book is an incredible feeling for any author. Did any reviewer say that this is what I felt when reading your book? And did it tie to your promise that you made when you were creating it?
Absolutely. So many people reached out. And this is a really funny story. I released the book on a Tuesday night in June. It was stormy and people came and got their first copies. And the next morning I get up and my inbox is full of angry emails from people who said they bought the book and they were so invested they actually stayed up all night to read it. And you know, there were
Really?
tears, there were, you know, applause and all this joy and just this emotion that they were, you know, they were expressing to me that I had brought out in them just by telling them a story with words.
Wow, that
It's
that is
amazing.
incredible. I've never had a guest that said that. I got an inbox full of replies. I mean, congratulations to you, John. I mean, that's an incredible thing. And would you say that almost kind of validates yourself as an author? Because I know a
Yes.
lot of people, especially a lot of people I've interviewed, they that's probably the best thing. It's not about how much money we make from the book sales. It's not about if we get like on the New York Billboard's top 100 list or anything. It's just getting those connections and getting readers who love it. That is the true validation. What was going through your mind when you saw those emails in your inbox saying, I love this, I stayed up all night, how could you make me feel all this emotion? Like, what was going through your mind, like seeing all that?
Well, you know, the first thing I see is 25 emails, and it's probably 2025. And I'm thinking, oh my God, first thing, they found a mistake or a spelling error or something is wrong, or there's like a signature, you know, 16 pages missing. And I'm panicking until I get to the first and the second and the third. And it's just, you know, I wanted to cry because it was just so amazing to hear from these people. And yeah, a lot of them are my friends and family, but they were, I believe, honest about their emotions. I was getting emails, you know, 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So they must have been, you know, motivated to send it at that point and say, this is what you did to me. This is how you, you know, transported me to the 19th century of Richmond. And it was just amazing. I'm still coasting on that feeling at this point.
Wow, that's actually incredible. And thank you for bringing up Richmond, because it kind of leads into the next question I did want to ask you is, can you tell the listeners and viewers about the world of Richmond at this time, especially through the eyes of your characters in the story? Like, when we think of like after the Civil War, we kind of think of like, you know, of course, Reconstruction because it's around that time. But in your book, it talks about a different history through these gentlemen's eyes. So what is Richmond for them? And how is it different from the rate for the average individual?
Well, Lewis Ginter had a number of business successes, and his older sister, who took him in, Jane Aarons, when he was orphaned at 10, so she became his guardian at 10 years old, had married into money. So they had a different view of the world. If you remember from your Civil War history, the Union armies were approaching Richmond. The
Hmm.
citizens of Richmond burned down the city to
Yeah.
stop the Union Army from getting anything. They burned their warehouses and homes burned. And once it got out of control, it was just devastation. Lewis packed up with his sister and went back to New York for a few years while Richmond rebuilt. And I really think he carried with him a sense of guilt, not being part of that Richmond rebuilding, because he had adopted that as his home. He served in the Confederacy as a major in the quartermaster, which is, supply lines, commissary, that kind of thing. So he probably felt, I'm giving up on these people, but I can't live here with my sister who's accustomed to having more. That's where he met John Pope. So that really changed
Oh.
his whole life's trajectory. When his sister moved back, he stayed another, couple of months to close out his bank. And then he brought this young man with him. And they get back to Richmond. It is 1870. So we're just talking 5 years after the war. There are still dirt roads. There are buildings that are missing. There are new
Mm.
structures going up, but there really isn't much. So he sees we need neighborhoods, we need streets, we need transportation. And he starts using his money and his influence to make those things happen. He never wanted his name associated with any of it. So we have all these neighborhoods, churches, parks named after Ginnter, Ginnter, Ginnter. And he didn't want that. He wanted just to put the stuff out there for people to enjoy. And he never named anything after himself. He built a five-star hotel called the Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was his idol. He worshiped anything the man said or did. So he built the Jefferson, and it is still in existence. It's a five-star hotel, fabulous place.
Ooh.
We can't afford to go there, but it is. And he didn't name it after himself. And there are all these other things that he did where he gave his money, his time, his connections, and he did not want his name associated with it. So most Richmonders don't know that he didn't do, all the development, that he was the driving force. Um, he wanted to put electric trolleys in. Richmond is the first town in North America to have working electric trolleys with tracks. And because we didn't have a power source, he was the very first investor in what is now Dominion Energy, our power company. There's a sign
Wow.
with his name on it from 1890 something. Electricity is dangerous and deadly at this point, and he's saying we've got to go forward here. Um, he realizes that he has so much competition in the cigarette space because that's where people are moving to. It was cigars and then pipe and then maybe chewing tobacco, but people wanted cigarettes, but they would break in people's pockets because men's pockets weren't what they are today. And he
Right.
said, let's take a card, a stiff white card, print it with a pretty picture and slip it in there and use it as a splint. And he learned the word splint, of course, through the war, because that's what you do with a broken bone. And everybody's saying this is a dumb idea. Why we're going to spend more money and take money away from our product? So he invents the trading card, the trading card. You don't think of
Really?
sports cards or anything else. He was the guy who said, let's do this. And his cards are still in demand today. They did flowers, they did world leaders, they did women, they did men, they did sports authorities. It was just all these amazing cards. And that's what's on the cover of the book is those cards, that he actually
Really?
cigarette packets. Yes.
Oh my gosh. So pretty much this guy did everything. He was like in like every avenue. So I guess kind of like my next question is why has no one ever like talked about it? If he was this influential in his community at the time, if he made such a big impact, why has there never been more documentation on him? What did you find in your research that sort of led you to that limited amount of research about him?
Well, there's this problem in history that I call the stag problem. If a man doesn't marry and have children and have, heirs and all of those things that carry on the family name, when they die, their work starts to, fall out of the public's mind. When he died in 1897, he didn't have any direct heirs other than his niece. Everybody knew her already. She was already, dabbling in philanthropy and that kind of thing. But, because he didn't have children, he didn't leave, these large, vast properties to all of these kids to, to manage. Once he died off, the people start to forget who he was, even though his name is on a lot of communities and churches and things like that. The hotel he didn't name after himself. We have a botanical garden named for him, but that was his niece's doing. So there's this gap of 40 or 50 years where people just don't even talk about him.
Wow, that is unfortunate.
Yeah.
And what about John Pope? How did they meet? You already mentioned before that they met earlier in life, but how does their relationship change throughout the reconstruction of Richmond, Virginia? Like, does he play a role in that, or does he come later in the story?
So remember, Lewis went back to New York when Richmond is in ruins, stays there for about 3 or 4 years, and when he comes back to Richmond to live for the rest of his life, probably 1870, 1871, he brought John Pope with him. John Pope was a clerk and a delivery boy that would bring packages to his office, and they developed a rapport, like we talked to the Prime guy or the UPS guy, you just sort of make friends. But they hit it off. They talked about books, and they did all this. And so he said, this young man is going to struggle if he stays in New York. I'm going to take him back to Richmond with me, with his parents' permission, even though he was 18. He takes him back to Richmond, and he puts him under the tutelage of his partner. His business partner is John Frederick Allen. And what John Allen does is he treats him like any other employee. He's got to sweep the floors. He's got to learn from the ground up. He's got to do all the other jobs, knowing for a fact that he's probably going to matriculate into that, executive role. But, being an executive that's done all those jobs, it's easier to tell people, do it this way, because I've done it that way also when it was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So he grooms John, and John becomes a manager, becomes the person who's in charge of all their inventory. And then he eventually becomes a vice president when John Allen retires. So these two men are the richest men in Virginia. We're talking Vanderbilt money,
Really, that wealthy?
Yeah, J.P. Morgan. When Lewis died, he had $20 million in cash that he gave to his niece. And this is 1897. That's a lot of money today.
That is a lot of money.
Then, that's just astounding.
Wow. Holy.
So John Pope is there the whole time, but he's sort of in a shadow role. He's doing what Lewis is asking him to do and what John Allen is asking him to do, but he's also learning. He's sending money home to his family that stayed in New York. He starts working with the Catholic charities. He was a devout Catholic. Pope, he was Irish. And he did all these things for the Irish charities or the children's charities and orphanages, where he would go and spend time with the boys and make sure that they had not only food and education, but actually skills. So they would work on sporting skills and other things, so they could actually become useful citizens once they got out of the orphanage. They weren't going to be abandoned. So he was thinking about the entire person as a child without a family. So when he died young. He died at 40 of a throat infection because there's no antibiotics. No. There's no good surgery. It's just not a good time to get sick. The list of stuff that he had done was amazing. Everybody's looking around thinking, wow, he paid for that orphanage and he paid for that church, but they just had so much money, they gave it away freely.
Wow. I did not know any of this, but to think that there was someone on the level like the Vanderbilts and all the powerful families at that time, because most people, even if you're not an astute person of history, you've heard of the Vanderbilts, you've heard of the Fords, you've heard of the families that ran the train mills and all that stuff. You've heard about them. I've never heard about Lewis or John Pope. And it's unfortunate that these two men, with the aid of their employees and allies who have helped him, rebuilt a city literally from the ground up after the war, like 5 years. I mean, that's incredible. And it's very, very sad that there's not a lot of scholarship on them or just mentioning their achievements. And that kind of leads into the follow-up question, John. When you were constructing this story, and I imagine getting the research or trying to craft it was daunting because this is an obscure piece of history that no one knows about. There's probably little or to no information. You probably have to find other sources, either bank documents or museums information, and that can be daunting for a historical writer. So, in that time when creating this story, did you have any self doubts? Or if you didn't, what sort of kept you going to tell this story? Like, why was this story so important to you that it needed to be told?
Yeah, I still carry around a lot of doubts. So, but I would go to our libraries and I would go to our historical societies. And of course, this is before COVID, so you could actually talk to human beings. And I'd say, this is what I'm trying to do. And these amazing people called librarians would just go, oh my gosh, I've got a whole treasure trove of that. And they take me over to, an archive, and they say, you've got to wear these gloves, but you can go through this page by page. And there were just amazing things that the Library of Virginia collected, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. All these places had, just had treasure troves of things because he had given it away, and because so much of it was nobody else wanted it at the time.
Oh, wow.
In the actual real world in 1890, he is invited to present in Melbourne, Australia for the World Expo. So he gets on a train in Richmond, goes from Richmond to Chicago to San Francisco, gets on a boat, goes to Honolulu, goes to Sydney, Australia, and then presents in Melbourne, Australia. And that's where we think he got all of his ideas for the garden, the streets, the electric trams, because they were so far advanced for what our country was doing. Then, they don't actually come back from that. He surprises his niece by going up through the brand new, newly opened Suez Canal. So they cross the Indian Ocean, past Africa, past, India, and they're up in through Europe and through the Mediterranean. They take a train all the way to London, and then finally they get on a ship and come back to New York. So they're gone 4.5 months.
Wow.
And I tell you all that because the Library of Virginia, our main library in the state, has a copy of her journal from that gives a daily account of what they saw and did in this beautiful, flourishing handwriting in this huge, heavy book. And it's like, working out of the gym to lift it.
Dang.
But I wouldn't have known that even existed because most of their papers were gone. They didn't have many heirs. They didn't have kids who were trying to preserve their legacy. So that they were just destroyed or they left to rot.
That is unfortunate. I always get sad when historical records or artifacts are just sort of faded away. It is a very, very sad thing, and why it's important to preserve pieces of history because they provide more evidence or lost stories that we need to tell. And on the topic of stories, for you, John, what authors would you say sort of played a role in the crafting of your author's voice? Because I know a lot of authors read either in the same genre that they're writing to craft their own style of voice.
So I stumbled across this author. He's British, and his name is Patrick Gale, Gale. He's a British guy. He writes some of the most amazing stories. And I just happened to pick up a book of his called A Place Called Winter. And it's this British gentleman dandy in, about the same time period who just can't get his way through society and make a success of himself. He's unhappy. He's making all these mistakes, and he decides to take an offer from the British government to take 160 acres in Alberta, Canada.
Oh,
And if he
geez.
can farm that, and this is a British dandy who doesn't even garden, if he can farm that for 5 years, he owns it. And he gets out there and he is overwhelmed, but he has people helping him, the neighbors, he's got some good fortune going on, and the story is just amazing. But the key part of the story for me is that when he finds this acreage, there's a couple living next door, and he finds out it's a brother and a sister. And the brother and sister had left Toronto because the brother had fallen in love with one of his professors. So it turns
Oh,
out
boy.
these two men make a connection, and it's such a sweet, tender love story of these two men. And then you get through the whole thing, and it's tears and it's joy. And then he describes at the end that was his actual uncle. Everybody knew he had an uncle that went to Canada, and they had a few pictures, and then he lived with another man, but nobody had ever, really traced the story. So he did everything he could, and then he filled in the gaps.
Dang. That sounds like a movie that I would see. Like the
I know.
story is just
I want the
so
movie in
good.
that one. Yeah.
My gosh. See, that's why I love talking to authors about the books that really inspire them, because I know nothing of these types of stories, but I'm always interested and I'm always intrigued by what motivates an author to make their own story. Now, kind of on that same line, what specific books would you say really helped craft sort of the world of the mid to late 19th century? What books really helped with that?
Well, I focused on two things. I read a lot of books. Some of them were terrible, about Reconstruction, era. But I also focused on the Gilded Age, because that's really where their, time comes into play. By the time they're making tobacco for the masses, they're bringing in millions of dollars a year. And these two men are realizing they need servants, they need people they can trust. So it really is more like a Gilded Age story. And those references are so easy to find. Vanderbilt builds his Biltmore, and Pierpont and J.P. Morgan all build those houses in New York. And of course, I love the series on HBO, the Gilded Age by Julian Fellowes.
Yes.
That just came out after I wrote, so I could have used it first. But that kind of thing where it's very stuffy, the roles are very defined. You don't talk outside your class. You don't talk outside your little social circle. And then these men did all of those things wrong. They broke all those rules. When they wanted to make cigarettes, they had a meeting with the staff, and they said, the only way we're going to be able to do this is to hire women, which was unheard of at the time. But women's hands, from sewing and the size of their fingers, are very nimble and can roll cigarettes very quickly.
Right.
So Lewis Ginter at this point becomes a feminist in our terms, because he's hiring women where most of them are widows or spinsters from the war who can't get work anywhere but servant, type jobs. He's paying them a living wage. He's giving them opportunities that they wouldn't have had, because most of these women are still living with their families. They can't afford a place of their own.
Right.
A fifth of our population in Virginia had died in the war, so men were missing, the families were trying to rebuild. And he steps in and says, let's do this, and we're going to hire women, and we're going to make it work.
Man, again, why is no one talking about this?
I know. He's such an amazing guy.
It is, because you think, like, with everything, because I know nothing about the Gilded Age. It's very limited, but from my understanding, it's almost like you could argue like the rise of the American aristocracy, the wealthy elite, the rise of these powerful families. And here you have this man who fits in the same social class because of his wealth, but he's doing everything that the fellow elites would not do. He is breaking all the rules. He is pretty much a rebel in a sense that I have all this wealth. I could do so much good with it. That's what I'm going to dedicate my life to. It's kind of like an inspiring, motivating story, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I'm astounded at what he accomplished, thinking they had no running water, no electricity. There wasn't a grocery store they could run to. They actually had to get people to do those things or do them themselves. You think of the modern conveniences we have now, you hop in the car and you're anywhere you want to be in an hour. They just didn't have that. But they still accomplished all this. I tell people he was the Steve Jobs of the 19th century.
Man, oh man. From what I'm learning from you, this man truly did rebuild this city, and it's literally the reason why Richmond, Virginia, is prosperous as it is now. And I can't even imagine how different Richmond's history would be if a person like Lewis or even his companions, John Pope, or his employees, if they didn't rally together to save this city. Because as you said, like, the population was pretty much gone. Most of the men were dead or probably wounded or just non-existent. Families were destroyed. The economy was ruined. It was just awful. It was very, very bleak. And yet here you have this man with his friends, his companions, who rallied together and just rebuild this city. And I'm just so mad that no one's talked about this. But then again, as I've learned from one of my other authors who've said, if there's a story that needs to be told, then you do it. Be that person who writes the story. And kind of along those lines, when you submitted this to the publisher, what were you kind of nervous about, being that this was your first book that you were going to publish? Were you kind of hesitant? Did you do research? What was sort of now that side, the business side of being an author?
Well, I did the whole query thing. So I did classes on how to do a query letter. I had other authors look at my stuff and say, am I doing my pitch right? There's a conference in Richmond every October for writers, and they allow you to speak to an agent. So I would go and I'd sit down with an agent for 15 minutes and say, tell me what I'm doing wrong, because I'm not getting any responses to my query letters. And, all of that comes back to, you have to craft it for them to digest in 30 seconds. It's just like the job market now, where you throw your resume out. Even if you walk on water or you're perfect, they don't know that from the first thing they read. You have to capture their attention. So the first thing that one has to do is to come up with a great tagline. Those 20 words or less that describe everything about the book that readers are going to say, I've got to have that today. The next one is, getting your BISAC, the book industry standard codes, getting those nailed down. I realized too late that I was using the wrong code. I called my book historical fiction, but it's actually biographical fiction because it's focused on one or two people. And that puts it in a different category for Amazon, for the book places. I mean, it's shelved differently. I'm not going to make that mistake going forward because that's what I like to write. But just if somebody had told me that, don't do this.
That's actually really interesting, because I've never heard of the term biographical fiction. I mean, it is historical fiction because it is talking about history, but the character, at least from my understanding, Lewis and John are both real characters, and you're following their life. So it is a biography, but you're just filling in the gaps to sort of flow the story. So that is actually really interesting, biographical fiction. I've never heard of that, and it really does kind of show that it is historical fiction because it is history, but it's not. It's telling their life. So when you finally nail that down and fine tune it, was that the same mindset you went with your other books? Because I know you've written quite a few other books, correct?
Well, I didn't discover I have written other books. The sequel to this one is his niece and what she does with her money that she receives. She is just an amazing woman. Mary's Grace came out last September. It's doing very well. I've got two more in this series. There's 100 years of influence that this family had on our town. Again, I discovered too late that I was using the wrong BISAC code, so I used the wrong one on hers. But the next two, I will certainly use the right codes. If we reprint, and I hope we do, we'll put the new codes on there. It's all a learning process. There's so many things I would do differently. But going back, I would not write this same book the same way today. Just for the stuff
Really?
I learned. But some of the phrasing seems outdated, or it just kind of wonky to me. But I did what I could. I think people like the story. I'm always more critical of my work than other people would be.
Hmm. No one's more critical than ourselves of our own work. When we look at our work that we've written, after like a few years, it's like, wow, I could have written that so differently. But it is a feeling that we got something out. We got a passion project of ours out in the world. And yeah, we can always edit it, we can always change it. But the fact that it exists is incredible. And kind of leading on to, before we get into the final question, there's one last question for you, John. It's probably one of the most important. Have you ever gotten a sense of validation from not just your fellow readers, but also historians that you may have met online who have seen your work, read it, and were impressed, saying that you belong in this field? Or were you not looking for a sense of validation from the historical community, that you didn't write Ginter's Pope for the sense of validation?
And I think the validation I got was, different levels. First, accomplishing the finishing of the book, and then getting a contract and putting it out there is, such a milestone in any writer's life, that first time you publish. But as the feedback came, in, and I had true historians. There is a woman in Richmond who is a historian that has focused on not Ginnter, but his niece. Her whole work has been around this on a PhD. She came back with such a glowing review and has recommended me in other writing circles, for speaking engagements, for people to read my books or include me in the discussion. It's just amazing that people would do that for each other. That whole all the boats rise, with the tide. I love that kind of thing, where we're not going to hold anyone back. We're going to help people up. We're
Right.
gonna, if it's not good, we're probably gonna tell them quietly, you could have fixed this or this. But if it's great, we're gonna sing those praises. And I try to do the same thing as I get a platform. I want to talk about other people's books that I think really need more attention.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we're now nearing the end of the interview, so we're now reaching to the last question. I'm actually going to combine two of them into one. So the question for you, John, is what is your word of wisdom to authors who are struggling to get their book out? And would you recommend possibly getting yourself in a writer's group, as you've mentioned in the interview that it's really helped you with your writing?
My first rule for writing is never stop. There are no breaks. I don't believe in writer's block. I just think we're procrastinating, and I've been there. I'm guilty. I keep a little notebook with me all the time, and I'm always writing in that notebook as people say words that confuse me, or great phrasing. I love getting phrasing from, shows and things, but I keep
Same.
all of that, and it keeps those creative juices going. I'm always looking at a story and saying, well, what happened after that? And what happened after that? So definitely get people around you that are going to encourage you. I'm not a social person as much. So being in a writer's group, I think I would get caught up in the social part and not focus on the writing that I need to do. But I
Right.
can really see that for somebody who's struggling with their confidence, who needs a little feedback and some polishing before they finish a manuscript, farm those chapters out to some trusted friends that'll say, it's good, but you could do this better, or you could phrase this better. One of my first editors kept saying, tighten this up. And I had no idea what that meant. She never defined it for me. And I finally had to say, what do you mean? And she was like, oh, I didn't realize that people didn't know. And that learning that lingo and having people hold your hand through that process is the key to getting that finished work, even if it doesn't end up on a shelf somewhere.
Great advice, John. Great advice.
Thank
And
you.
with that, listeners, we arrive at the end of this wonderful interview. And I want to thank our guest, John Musgrove, for joining us today. John, thank you so much for joining us. Now, before we officially close out today, John, Can you tell our listeners and viewers where they can interact with you, learn more about your book? And actually, speaking of your book, where can they go and purchase it?
Okay, so the book is available anywhere that people would buy books. So it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Google, Apple. It's in a physical form because I have a traditional publishing contract. So it's in all the bookstores. Barnes and Nobles can get them. They're certainly in all the gift shops and the local bookstores here in Richmond. I think if you're not in Richmond, you probably need to order it or go online. But you can get audio, you can get ebook, you can get physical book. Same with my sequels to that. The next two coming out will be the same way. I'm active, really active on LinkedIn. I just love that professionalism and content that I get of people saying, okay, this is the way we need to deal with people. It's not all that, hand wringing and the other stuff that people do. So I'm on LinkedIn every day. I publish as a photographer. I put all of my stuff on Flickr, so people can find me there, and you can get there through my LinkedIn profile. I love Instagram for memes and cats and funny things. And of course, I learn about books and stuff that way too. I'm on Facebook as an author, but I don't go there much because I just find it to be a time sink. I can do that, or I can write. So I miss it, but I have to make a choice.
Awesome. I will link all those down below for you to check out, listeners. And again, thank you so much for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. Again, I want to thank our guest, John, for telling us about his amazing book and for enlightening me about a piece of history which I know nothing about. So, John, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, be on the lookout for the last few episodes coming out this week. If you follow my newsletter, you'll be up to date with my last two guests of February. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out.